Hey, missing listeners, we wanted to bring you an episode of Crawlspace that we think you'll really love. It's about a skyjacking, a very famous skyjacking, and the disappearance of D.B. Cooper. And our friend Eric Ulis has been hot on the case for years, and he's got some new information here that he shared with our Crawlspace audience, and we think our missing audience will really appreciate this kind of legwork and citizen sleuthing. Okay, so we're going to throw it to the Crawlspace episode now. Let us know what you think on Spotify or YouTube. And follow Crawlspace if you don't already. Thanks a lot for listening. Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today. Thank you so much. I love our guest. He is one of the most diligent investigators that we have on. The cases and the stories that he takes on are classic, historical, and he just breaks it down with this pragmatic mathematic method that is so interesting to kind of behold, and he's so articulate. Fan favorite too. But Tim, fans are also a favorite of knowing your mood twice a week. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, I'm very excited to introduce this conversation with our old buddy, Eric Ulis. And Eric is a leading expert on the D.B. Cooper mystery, also the Gardner Museum heist. And we're going to speak with him on our show about art crime called Empty Frames very soon. So check out Empty Frames if you're a big Eric Ulis fan, as we are. And we've also spoken with Eric about the JFK assassination back, I want to say, a couple years ago now on Crawlspace. So yeah, he is a fan favorite. He is one of the most well-known experts on the D.B. Cooper case, and that is what we're talking with Eric about today. He's got some fascinating updates.
He does, and I just want to go back in history just a little bit. He actually had turned me around. I was never a D.B. Cooper fan. I thought that whole story was just kind of overplayed and overtold, but he turned me around. He got me very much into this, including all of the minutia and nuances that are going into the investigation. And when you think about how old this investigation is, there has to be minutia and very fine tuning of your evidence. If this was an easy case to solve, it would have been solved already. But at this point, with technology not being what it was back in the 70s and 80s and what it is today, I mean, of course you're going to have to get down and dirty the way Eric is getting with this case. But he threw us a curveball right off the bat. We found out something new about him. I don't know if I want to spoil that here. He let us in on a part of his history that we didn't know about, and it's absolutely incredible to hear him tell the story about what he used to do as a young man. And also, I don't know if you remember this, Tim, but he, maybe unintentionally or intentionally, I don't know if he cares, he let his age slip by saying how old he was in what year. And I did the math 15 times because I was like, there's no way. But really cool conversation right off the bat here.
Yes, and of course, the D.B. Cooper case is from 1971. It was a skyjacking from November 24th, 1971, and D.B. Cooper had about $200,000 as he jumped out of the airplane. Mr. D.B. Cooper has never been found, but Eric Ulis is hot on the case, and we're talking molecular details here today, Lance, with Eric, and it's really interesting stuff.
And you can easily follow everything that Eric is doing by going to his website, ericulis.com, and that is spelled ERICULIS, all one word, ericulis.com.
Yep, it's great stuff, and he's got a YouTube page as well that he's updating regularly, so make sure to check it out. And we really hope you enjoy this conversation with Eric Ulis.
All right, we're going to break real quick for a commercial, and we'll be right back with the one and only Mr. Eric Ulis. Just to clear up, who are we having on the show again?
Eric Ulis.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Eric Ulis. Eric, how are you today?
I'm doing well, guys. How are you doing?
We're doing fantastic, and it's always great to have you come back on the show because that means that you probably have something new to talk about, something interesting, some new development in one of the many investigations that you embark upon. But for those out there who don't know who you are, can you refresh some memories?
I believe I've talked with you guys about a few different subjects, D.B. Cooper, Gardner Museum heist, JFK. I'm primarily known for my work on the D.B. Cooper case, been involved with the case for pretty actively for, I would say, about 15, 16 years now. Headlined a History Channel show about the case. Have also been featured on Netflix, Discovery Channel. Done a number of media interviews all related to D.B. Cooper. So my background, believe it or not, actually came from the world of professional blackjack as a card counter back in the day for a number of years. And as I've said before...
Did we know this?
No.
I don't know if you guys knew this or not, actually.
No, I don't think so.
Episode's over. That's it.
Yeah, that's
Wow.
was a big part of the 90s for me going into the 2000s. And, while on the surface it seems like they would be completely, unrelated, in reality, I think my experience playing, professional level blackjack card counters, if you think of the movie 21, Kevin Spacey, the MIT guys, that kind of thing, traveling to Vegas, winning and losing all kinds of money, that kind of stuff, but more winning than losing. It really went a long ways towards informing really sort of my mindset with respect to this and how I approach these cases, these mysteries. Pretty much, I would describe myself as really no nonsense, try to focus on the evidence, the facts, the science, the math as we understand it. And that's really been my forte as far as the D.B. Cooper case is concerned. So that's a little bit about who I am. And so we'll just kind of leave it at that. So
No, we're not. How did you get into card counting?
that was actually very serendipitous. I'll tell you a quick story here. So I was married back then. This was back in 1987. So I was 21 years old back then. I remember it was Father's Day, actually. I was going to school, going to college, but also working as a waiter, as a food server. And like everybody else, I had rent to pay and everything else. And I remember writing a check, like about a week before rent was due or about the time rent was due, writing a check, thinking, well, I don't have the money to cover the check now, but I'll be working, earning tips over the next 4 or 5 days and I'll be able to cover the check. Well, as it worked out, I didn't earn enough money to cover the check. And I distinctly remember thinking I'm like $70 short. And I'm like, this check is going to bounce. Like, I'm not gonna be able to cover rent, So I was talking about it with my then wife, thinking, what the hell am I going to do? Me and my infinite wisdom came up with this brilliant idea. I'm like, you know what? I tell you what, let's do this. Let's get in the car and drive to Nevada. I was about 2 hours away from Nevada at that point. I was living in Salt Lake City, Utah at that point. I'm like, let's drive across the desert 2 hours and let's take $100. I'm going to take $100. I'm going to put $100 on one hand of blackjack. And my thought was, if I win, then great. I win $100. I've got enough to cover the check. We're all good or whatever. And if I lose $100, well, I couldn't fucking cover the check anyway. So that was sort of like literally how my mind processed this whole thing. And of course, she thought it was a brilliant idea. We were meant for each other, apparently. So we jet across the desert there. And we've got, again, this is Father's Day. So we're meeting my parents later in the day for Father's Day dinner. We, make the 2 hour trip across the desert. My son at that point is a year old, basically, maybe a little less than a year old at that point. And I remember pulling into the casino, which was just over the state line, pulling in the parking lot, didn't even turn the car off. And I said, I tell you what, you just sit right here. I'll be right back. So I literally walk into the casino. I'm kind of nervous. Take out $100 and put it on, one hand of blackjack. And the table that I approached, the dealer was just standing there all by herself. There was no one there. And it's a single deck game of blackjack. And I didn't really know much about blackjack other than kind of know how to play like most people know how to play. And I'll never forget this. I give her the $100. She gives me a yellow chip, a $100 yellow chip, and I put it on the spot to play blackjack. And she shuffles up the cards and throws out the cards to me. And I'll never forget how this whole thing works. So first of all, her up card, her top card is a 7. So she's got a 7 showing. So I pick up my hand and I've got an ace and a 6. So for those of you who play blackjack, you'll know that that's a soft 17. And I'm like, I got $100 riding on this. I'm like, what the fuck do I do? So I hit. And she gives me a 10. So now I've got a hard 17. And I'm like, I stand. I'm like, okay, I'm going to stand on that. So she has the 7 up. She flips up her whole card, which is a 10. So we both have 17, which is a push, which is a tie. So I'm like, wow, I actually tied. And so nothing happens. And I actually, for a fleeting moment, thought maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we should just take the 100 and roll. But I'm like, no, I'll just keep it out there. So she flips out the cards again, throws out the cards again quickly. And I remember this time she has a 4 up. And I pick up my 2 cards and I have a blackjack, an ace and a 10 blackjack. Now, for those of you who don't know, a blackjack, if you get on the first 2 cards, you automatically win. And you don't just win your bet, you actually win 1.5 times your bet. So instead of winning $100, I actually won $150. And I was like, oh, hell yeah. I'm like, I was just stoked. So I cash out. I throw her a $5 tip. I cash out and collect the cash and go to the car and tell my then wife the story about, how I won $150 and didn't just win $150. So we're driving back, of course, going to my parents' house. And I know this is a little bit of a story here. And I'm like, we can't tell my parents this because my parents, are buttoned up straight-laced. My dad, worked for NASA and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, they're going to literally think I'm insane. Like I'm just crazy person for doing this. So we go to my parents' house and it's kind of getting the better of me. I'm like, I got to tell somebody the story about how I won blackjack, won this $150. I tell my parents, I'm like, I got to tell you the story. I know you think your son is crazy, but here's what happened. And so we started talking about like, what are the odds and all this other kind of stuff. And it just so happened that my father happened to have a book about counting cards by a guy, a very famous guy, mathematician guy. I believe he was a mathematician, but he dealt with blackjack, a guy named Stanford Wong. And that's a fake name. He was a professional player, and that's the name he uses, Stanford Wong, based in Northern California. We started talking about counting cards, and I never really knew anything about it. But I asked my parents, my father, I said, do you mind if I take the book? Do you mind if I take it home and just kind of read through it? And honestly, I just absorbed, I consumed that book and just everything I could about card counting, basically taught myself by reading, because there's a very precise way, mathematical way to play. Basically, that was my entree into professional level card counting blackjack. I just absorbed it honestly, it was like a sponge taking on water. And for the next decade or so, that's what I did for a living. I was very successful at it. This is the 90s. I'm pulling down 6 figures a year playing cards, playing blackjack on the weekends. Eventually moved to Seattle. I'd leave on Fridays, fly to Nevada, play Friday night, Saturday night, maybe a little Sunday morning, then Sunday, later in the day, Sunday, I'd fly back to Seattle. And I did that for a long time. It is an interesting experience. Card counting is not illegal. It's not illegal to do because I'm using just my brain. I'm not using any kind of instrument or what have you. But in Nevada, they do reserve the right to bar you. If they think you're a skilled player and whatever, they can bar you from playing. I eventually, I ended up getting barred from a number of casinos. Usually they would send a floor supervisor up who would ask me to step away from the table and introduce him or herself and say, usually they were gracious about, they say, you're just too good, for us, whatever. You're welcome to play any of the other games in the house, but we don't want you playing blackjack. That was my experience counting cards and playing blackjack. And like I said, the beautiful thing about counting cards and blackjack is it's precise. You can think you're the greatest player in the world, and you can think that you're good enough to beat the game, but the proof is in the pudding. If at the end of the year, you've lost a ton of money, you lost money, you ain't as good as you think you are, that kind of thing. So there's a check there. Whether you're good or not. And mind you, as a proficient top professional blackjack player, you're 1.5% to a 2% edge over the house. So it's a very small edge. So any given day you could actually lose. It's entirely possible that you lose. In fact, you lose a lot because it's a very small edge. But over the long run, there's this thing called the law of large numbers, mathematical principle. And over the long run, if you're playing as an advantage player, eventually you grind out a win and you can actually end up winning quite a bit over time. But I was playing high-level blackjack or what have you, and that's kind of my entree and my story as far as that goes. But like I said, I learned a lot from that in terms of how to approach, like in the case of these cold cases, how to tackle some of these mysteries. Because I said many times before that, mysteries are mysteries for a reason. Invariably, somebody missed something somewhere, somehow, at some time. They made a mistake somewhere along the line. And my job is to try to identify the mistake, identify the error. Like I said, take the evidence that we have and go with that and see ultimately what I can learn and what I can come up with. And it's that sort of methodology, mindset that I've used to approach these cases. And so I'm not prone to conspiracies and crazy shit and, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I consider myself a pretty grounded individual as far as that's concerned. Now, having said that, when you're dealing with cases like D.B. Cooper, you're dealing with a complicated puzzle with a lot of pieces, and you don't have a lot of the pieces. You have some of them. You don't have, a lot of them. Conjecture and educated guesses and that type of thing is part of the equation at this point, trying to figure out who he was and what happened. So there you go. How's that for a nice little story that you probably never heard before?
That is unbelievable. Yeah, definitely never heard that from you and didn't expect to hear that either. Wow, that was really cool, though. God, we got to get you to the casino.
That's right. You've got the casino up there in Boston and Everett there, the Wynn Casino. So, yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned D.B. Cooper. You have been working on that case. We spoke with you a few times now. I want to say at least once about D.B. Cooper specifically, maybe twice. But you have got some updates to share. I'm curious about those updates. And I guess if you don't mind just kind of circling back a little bit on the latest theory, if you recall, that you shared on our show.
Yeah, sure. So D.B. Cooper, just for a little refresher for people who don't know, was a guy who skyjacked a jet going from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington on November 24th, 1971, which was Thanksgiving Eve. So it was a Wednesday evening. As the jet was taking off from Portland, he handed a note to one of the flight attendants saying that he had a bomb and that he's skyjacking the jet. She came and sat by him. He issued several demands, which amounted to, I want $200,000 in cash. I want 4 parachutes, which included 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. So 2 sets of parachutes, but 4 parachutes in total. And he had some other demands. I don't want the jet to land in Seattle until all the stuff is staged at the airport when the jet lands. I want, the jet to immediately be refueled and all these other kind of things. And he said, essentially, if I get what I want, then I'll let the passengers go. There were a total of 36 passengers on the jet, D.B. Cooper included. Now, importantly, this was 1971. You didn't need identification to, get a ticket. You didn't go through security. There was no TSA or anything like that back then. So he did present what appeared to be a bomb in an attaché case that he walked on board the jet with. So that was, the threat. When he showed up in Portland, he bought the ticket in cash. It was a $20 flight from Portland to Seattle, and he gave the name Dan Cooper, obviously not a real name, but Dan Cooper. Now, as the media reported on this in the wake of the skyjacking, there was a reporter who misheard the name and thought that the name of the skyjacker had given was D.B. Cooper, not realizing it was Dan Cooper. It was reported as the skyjacker being known as D.B. Cooper. Well, the media and everybody quickly realized thereafter that no, the name wasn't D.B. Cooper, it was Dan Cooper. But the name D.B. Cooper has always stuck. And I've always said it's just a more badass sounding skyjacker-ish kind of a name. So it just sounds more James Bond-like. So D.B. Cooper has always stuck. So either way, to make a long story short, the guy gets the parachutes, the money, everything in Seattle, lets the passengers go. He lets everybody go except the 3 pilots and one of the flight attendants. He orders the jet to take off south toward Mexico City. They had a planned refuel stop in Reno, Nevada. Now, importantly, the type of jet that he was on, the type of airliner he was on, which was a Northwest Orient airliner, was a Boeing 727. Why that's an important jet is because the Boeing 727 has this air stairs apparatus that deploys from the back bottom of the fuselage. Reason that they have these air stairs built into the back bottom of the fuselage on the 727 is that if they were servicing a smaller airport that maybe didn't have a jet walk or a truck with the air stairs on it or what have you, It was unnecessary. They could literally just pull on the runway and lower the air stairs there, and passengers could actually deboard the plane, disembark from the plane, or board the plane using those air stairs. So that's the reason for that. D.B. Cooper wanted those air stairs deployed in flight, and that's actually what happened. They were deployed in flight after they departed Seattle. So about 36 minutes after taking off from Seattle, with the 3 pilots in the cockpit and the 1 flight attendant also in the cockpit by that time, about 36 minutes after taking off, D.B. Cooper jumped from the jet mid-flight. The jet was traveling about 10,000 feet up. It was pitch black outside, kind of a dreary night, traveling at about 200 miles an hour, but he jumped out with a couple of the parachutes and the money never to be seen or heard from again. That's basically what happened there. Now, he was dressed quite smartly as a business person, wearing a suit and a tie. Before he jumped, he took off his tie, which happened to be a cheap, skinny black clip-on tie from JCPenney. He took it off, threw it on his chair, and left it behind. Now, I think that was an oversight. I don't believe he intended to leave the tie behind. But with everything going on and the lights out in the back and it's noisy and all that kind of stuff, the chair was dark blue and the tie was black. I just think he didn't notice it and just forgot about it. Well, obviously the authorities recovered that tie after the plane landed in Reno, and the authorities realized, D.B. Cooper's not here anymore. But back in 1971, it didn't serve as much of a piece of evidence for anybody. There's only so much you could do with the tie. Well, if you fast forward 45, 50 years, now it's been 53 years, the tie has actually served as kind of the holy grail, if you will. It's a treasure trove of evidence. It's been exposed to a scanning electron microscope, and there's a lot from the tie, a lot of particles in particular that have come from the tie that are remarkable and tell a story. Specifically, a lot of titanium, commercially pure titanium, alloy titanium, rare earth elements, stainless steel, aluminum, and a whole array of other things, including initially what we understood to be a fair amount of salt and a fair amount of sand on the tie. Why that's important is because as the tie was examined and as particles from the tie have been examined under a scanning electron microscope, there have been well over 100,000 particles that have been identified that came from the tie. And when you're talking about, for example, titanium in particular, people don't think much of titanium today because titanium is quite common. Frying pans, wedding rings, aircraft, all kinds of things that titanium's used for. But back in the late 60s, up until 1971 when the skyjacking took place, titanium was quite rare, actually. It was used primarily in aerospace and also the chemical industry. So that was a pretty telling clue because it appears to indicate that D.B. Cooper had some sort of relationship with the aerospace sector. And that makes sense because obviously the skyjacking took place on an airplane and the guy jumped, mid-flight with a parachute and everything else. So that kind of makes sense. And also it's important to note that he was a guy that was described by the witnesses as clean cut and about 50 years of age. So a relatively old guy, to be jumping out of an airplane like that. So basically why this is all important and where I'm driving at here is that several years ago, I want to say maybe 3-4 years ago, I started digging into the data related to some of the particles on the tie. In particular, I found a very specific particle related to an alloy, a titanium and antimony alloy. And that titanium and antimony alloy appeared to correlate with a U.S. patent that was granted to a company called Remcrew Titanium, which later became known as Crucible Steel. They're headquartered around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They were a specialty metals outfit. And importantly, they were a significant subcontractor, a significant supplier of titanium and other metals to Boeing. So that seemed to be a real clear connection there. Ultimately, I deduced, looking at everything, that D.B. Cooper probably came from Remcrew Titanium or this Crucible Steel, likely was a metallurgist working in the titanium research lab. And I thought that there's a reasonable chance that he was a guy named Vince Peterson. He's a guy that I talked about before, I believe, on your show, Vince Peterson. Well, within the last year, we analyzed part of the particles that came from D.B. Cooper's tie in much greater depth, much greater detail. And we got some additional data that came back. what's very important here is that there's a few new particles that were discovered on the tie. There are 2 uranium particles and 2 thorium particles that were found on the tie. So we've got 2 uranium and 2 thorium, but one of the uranium and thorium particles overlap. So in other words, you have a thorium-uranium particle in and of itself. So you have 3 different particles. Why that's critically important is that, as you can imagine, this isn't the kind of stuff you just happen to come across every day, just out in the ether. I started digging into those particles, in particular the thorium and uranium particle, and trying to figure out what that tells us about D.B. Cooper, where he came from. Ultimately, and this is very recent, I deduced that the thorium and uranium particle appears to correlate to a type of nuclear fuel that was being experimented with in the 1960s for a very specific type of nuclear reactor that was also being experimented with, specifically called a molten salt reactor. Why this is important is because if you're talking about Crucible Steel, the company that up to this point I've been thinking D.B. Cooper likely came from, they have no relationship with uranium, thorium, nuclear reactors, or anything of that nature. So there's a sudden curveball that's kind of thrown in the mix. There's stuff on D.B. Cooper's tie that cannot be explained if you think that he came from Crucible Steel, which appeared to indicate he couldn't have come from Crucible Steel. Therefore, Vince Peterson could not have been D.B. Cooper like I was originally thinking he may have been. Importantly, I started going down further into this, and I determined that it appears that where this particle came from, very unique, very rare thorium and uranium particle came from, was one of the national laboratories called the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. Just looking specifically at those 3 particles, those appear to point to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Now, I looked at the other particles that had been found on the tie previously, including powdered titanium and stainless steel, rare earths, and everything else, and verified that indeed those particles also could have come from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So that was very exciting because it appears that that's where D.B. Cooper came from, was this Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and it appears that he had some sort of tangential relationship or some sort of involvement with the molten salt reactor experiment that was taking place there, specifically between 1964 and 1969. That's when that molten salt reactor was actually operating as they were testing it out and so forth. So I do believe now, based upon this new additional evidence, that's where D.B. Cooper came from. I think he was a metallurgist or geologist or something. I don't think he was working specifically and exclusively on the molten salt reactor experiment, but I think he was working on a number of different things, some of which tied in with that. So that's a really, really big deal, obviously, because obviously as new information is coming in here, now this discovery of the thorium and uranium on the tie, that helps us zero in on where D.B. Cooper could have possibly come from. And I am highly confident that that's where D.B. Cooper came from. He had some sort of involvement there. He came from that Oak Ridge National Laboratory, worked there at some point in time during the late 1960s. It's important to note that everyone who worked at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory at that time was an employee of Union Carbide Corporation, which is a corporation that was later absorbed by Dow Chemicals. So now it's part of Dow Chemicals, but Union Carbide, for those of us who are old enough, remember some of their dealings back in the day. They were kind of a controversial company as a major polluter and so forth, which we won't get into here. So that's a critical find. That's a critical find, and it appears to indicate that that's where D.B. Cooper came from. Now, I want to say one other thing real quick here. One of the pieces of evidence that was found, or let me say it wasn't found, but one of the pieces of evidence that was noted relates to a book of matches that was used to light D.B. Cooper's cigarettes while he was on the flight, because D.B. Cooper smoked 7 cigarettes on the flight. And specifically, he had a book of matches and he would hand it to the flight attendant. Her name was Tina Mucklow. And Tina would strike a match and light D.B. Cooper's cigarette, and then D.B. Cooper would take the matchbook back. One of the matchbooks that was used, she described as being from a place called Sky Chef's Restaurant. It was a blue book of matches, the soft pack matches, 20 matches in there to strike. It said Sky Chef's Restaurant on it and everything else. Now, back in 1971, Sky Chef's Restaurant only had 16 locations across the United States, all of which were located in airports. So it seems all but certain that D.B. Cooper had to have picked up this book of matches at one of those 16 restaurants across the United States. So if you look at those 16 locations, notably, one of the 16 locations is the McGee-Tyson Airport, which is the airport that serves Knoxville, Tennessee, that serves Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that area there. So that does appear to be a very intriguing piece of evidence that indicates that, D.B. Cooper was in that area, that he came from that Knoxville, Tennessee area and used that airport and indeed visited that Sky Chef's Restaurant previous to the skyjacking and picked up that book of matches from that location. So that's an intriguing thing as well as far as this is concerned. It's a lot of talking there, guys.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
You said that the tie was a clip-on tie from, I think you said JCPenney.
Yeah.
Do you think that tie was something that he wore at work? Or do you think that was something that he wore outside of work and just got the particles on it from being at work previous or something?
We know the tie was manufactured in 1964. I've said, for purposes of the investigation, my assumption is that D.B. Cooper received the tie around Christmas of 1964. That means he would have been wearing the tie. Let's just say he could have effectively worn the tie starting January 1st, 1965. He could have been wearing it up until the day of the skyjacking, November 24, 1971. It does appear that D.B. Cooper wore that tie at work, that he had a job that required him wearing a tie, perhaps required him to wear a clip-on tie. So it's reasonable to deduce that the particles, the titanium and rare earth elements, stainless steel, iron, all the particles that are on the tie came from the area where he worked, wherever he worked, including the thorium and uranium. The tie was not particularly stylish as of 1971, so I suspect that he started wearing the tie in 65 at his job, and somewhere around 1968, 1969, he probably stopped wearing the tie because it kind of became outdated. Again, it was a skinny black clip-on tie, probably chucked it in, his drawer, what have you, and it just sat there for a few years. So when it came time to skyjack the jet, I think D.B. Cooper figured, let me just let me grab one of my old ties that's, it's a clip-on tie, which makes sense. Somebody can't grab it and strangle you with it or anything like that. It's black, so it's not particularly notable. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's what he did. And again, I believe he left it behind accidentally. Being able to dig into the tie particles and see where these particles came from, by definition, tells you to what environment or where the tie itself places the tie itself actually visited. And assuming that D.B. Cooper is the lone individual who used that tie, who wore that tie throughout its lifetime there, 65 to 69, whatever, that gives you an idea where D.B. Cooper traveled, the circles that D.B. Cooper was involved in. And so that's why it's critically important, because, again, the particles from the tie appear to show that D.B. Cooper worked at that Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. In a minute, I'll give you another fresh new update related to that as well. But that's kind of where we stand as far as the tie is concerned, and that's why that tie is so critically important.
Like, technically speaking, how do you look at these particles? Like where is that information? Is that from like the FBI site? And then how could no one else have come up with this information?
Well, it's important to note that the FBI has custody of the tie. They've had custody of the tie from the night of the skyjacking when they recovered it. The last that anybody saw it, sort of in the citizen sleuth kind of world, was me. In October of 2021, I was at the FBI headquarters, Washington, D.C., and I actually saw the tie myself. So we know as of October 2021, that's where the tie was. What happened here was there is a very innovative and out-of-the-box thinking FBI agent, a guy named Larry Carr, who's since retired, who was kind of, headed up the D.B. Cooper investigation, starting in about 2006, 2007. There wasn't much of an investigation at that point, but basically whatever of the investigation there was, he was the guy who kind of headed it up. And he decided, this case is still unsolved. We have no idea who this guy was. Let's throw some information out to the public. Let's open it up to the public to some degree, and let's see what they bring back to us. Ultimately, that led to Larry Carr working with a small group of private scientists, whereby Larry Carr and the FBI granted limited access to the tie and the other evidence to the small group of scientists. And the small group of scientists, the leader of that group is a guy named Tom Kay. And what Tom did, and when I say Tom, I really mean his little small group, the 3 people, Tom included. But what he did, he got access to the tie specifically on 2 occasions, once in 2009 and once in 2011. What he did is he had these things called carbon sticky stubs. They almost look like cufflinks. That you're not wearing. And what you would do is he would take a carbon sticky stub and he would push it onto the tie, and then he would just remove it from the tie. And because the stub itself that's touching the tie, which is the surface area is probably about the size of a dime, I would say, because it's sticky, when you touch it to the tie and pull it off the tie, it removes some of the particles and stuff that were on the tie. He took those carbon sticky stubs, and there were a couple of dozen of them that he applied to different parts along the tie. He took those carbon sticky stubs and he had those analyzed under a scanning electron microscope by a laboratory. Now, this was done in 2017. So it's this carbon sticky stubs that were analyzed by a lab under a scanning electron microscope that I could identify the particles that were on the carbon sticky stubs. It doesn't obviously identify all the particles on the tie, because clearly most of the tie hasn't been sticky stubbed. And there are things, obviously, that even though the carbon sticky stub was applied to the tie, they took it off. There are things that got left behind on the tie. Accounting for the stuff that actually came off the tie and is on the carbon sticky stubs, that's the stuff that we're analyzing, and that's the stuff that we've been using to try to determine where D.B. Cooper came from.
What is the next step in making that final determination that these particles were in fact from, what company was it?
Union Carbide, specifically at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. To the best of my knowledge, there's only really one place that can account for all of the different particles on the tie, because there's a broad array of particles from the tie. As I mentioned, there's the thorium, the uranium, there's the powdered titanium metal, there's stainless steel, rare earth elements, iron, a whole variety of things like that. And if you look at it in totality, it appears to me that there's really only one practical location that this stuff could have all come from, which is the, again, Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And again, let's not forget that matchbook cover as well, which seems to correlate with the location of that. There are a couple of other places and labs that were working on some stuff that kind of overlap. They either can't account for all of the particles, or there's not an airport nearby that's one of the SkyJacker locations. So invariably there's one problem or another when you're looking at the other places. This is the one location that appears to check all the boxes. This is actually an ideal segue into some of this newer information related to particles on the tie, hot off the press stuff here. You may recall at the beginning of the conversation here, I mentioned that among the things found on the tie, there was a significant amount of salt and there was a significant amount of sand that was found on the tie. Now, as it turns out, the sand is actually not sand, rather it is clay. Why that's important is because there's a very critical difference between sand and clay, specifically as it relates to the uses for sand versus the uses for clay. What I'm driving at here is that as I've dug into the newest data that is really been accumulated within the last year, scanning electron microscope data, the clay on the tie, again, it appears that there's not sand on the tie, but a fair amount of clay on the tie. And specifically, the clay appears to be what's called a bentonite type of clay. Why that's critically important is because Oak Ridge National Laboratory was one of very few places that was researching the use of bentonite clay for the purposes of storing nuclear waste. So they would use the bentonite clay to line deposits of nuclear waste. That's what they were exploring it for. Additionally, bentonite clay was being used to study for absorbing heavy metals and that type of thing. So that appears to be another very big clue here, given that there are literally tens of thousands of particles of this bentonite clay on the tie that correlate with the kind of work, the kind of activities, the things that they were doing at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, specifically as they relate to storing nuclear waste. So that is a really big deal as well, because there are a couple of other labs and so forth that were studying, that could account for some of the particles on the tie, but they had no relationship or weren't working at all with bentonite clay for the purposes of storing nuclear waste, or for that matter, for any purpose at all. At least that's been documented that I've come across. So that appears to be another big clue that points specifically to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Additionally, the salt. There was a significant amount of salt that was found on the tie. And it's not the kind of salt that you would find on McDonald's French fries. It's a different type of industrial type of salt. I've surmised that perhaps that salt was also related to the storage of nuclear waste, because during that same time, the late 1960s, as they were looking into the storing of nuclear waste and so forth, one of the things that they considered was storing this nuclear waste in salt deposits, large underground salt deposits, caverns and that type of thing. While on the surface, you think salt and sand initially, you think, that could come from anywhere, whatever the case may happen to be. One of the things I've always cautioned is let's not overlook the salt and the sand, because the sheer abundance of salt and the sand on the tie is, I think, pretty important, because it came from somewhere. I mean, it came from somewhere and it got on the tie somehow, somewhere. As it's turned out, it appears that sand, which is not sand after all, but bentonite clay, and then the salt as well, appear to be two very strong clues that also point to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So just looking at it collectively, looking at the totality of the evidence, I think it's a pretty safe bet that D.B. Cooper came from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was an employee of Union Carbide during that period of time. That's critically important, obviously, because it gives people like myself the opportunity to start digging into the men who worked in that area, that company at that time, to see if we can put a finger on D.B. Cooper and figure out who D.B. Cooper was. And I do think it's just a matter of time before we figure out who this guy is. I think we're getting very, very close to putting a finger on the real D.B. Cooper. And what's exciting to me is that this is all science-based. This is fact-based. This is evidence-based. This isn't some fantastical story, because honestly, stories of paratroopers and Green Berets and Vietnam guys and other badasses and characters, stories like that are a dime a dozen. That doesn't impress me. What I'm impressed with, and again, this kind of harkens back to the no-nonsense blackjack days, card counting days. What impresses me is the tangible stuff. Again, the facts, the science, the math, all that stuff, because that's the stuff that tells a story, and it speaks to the truth of what happened and who this guy was and where he came from. So at this point in time, that's where I'm focused, man. That's exactly where I'm focused. Perhaps something new gets added into the equation at some point. I don't know. But at this point in time, we've got a fair amount of evidence that we're working with here, well north of 100,000 particles. And there are a number of different sort of metrics and things that we can apply to these particles. And they appear to point pretty strongly at this Oak Ridge National Laboratory, specifically also point to the molten salt reactor experiment that took place there.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Super cool stuff. Well done in triangulating this. Have you come up with a potential suspect?
No. I have no idea who D.B. Cooper was, so I have no person of interest at this point. There's an interesting story that ties in with Oak Ridge, which I'll tell you about here. You know, the name that the skyjacker gave, was Dan Cooper. And there have been a lot of people that have speculated, where did the name Dan Cooper come from? Where did he come up with that name? And I've always kind of figured, well, he just kind of pulled it out of thin air. It's a reasonable assumption. But it is noteworthy that there was a longtime employee at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He worked there from 1962 to 1997. And this gentleman passed away, I think, in the early 2000s, somewhere around 2007, I believe, something like that, maybe a little later. But his name was Ralph Cooper. To be clear, right out of the gate, I don't think Ralph Cooper was D.B. Cooper, because Ralph Cooper would have been, I believe, 35 years of age at the time of the skyjacking. And again, D.B. Cooper was described as a guy around 50 years of age. Now, why Ralph Cooper is interesting is because in 1960, there was a fugitive that escaped from law enforcement in the area of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee. Ralph Cooper had an older brother whose name was Dan Cooper, and obviously Ralph Cooper also had a father as well. When the fugitive escaped, people in and around town were out trying to help law enforcement, trying to find this escaped fugitive, see if he was hiding or if he's lurking in the area there. Ralph Cooper's father and Ralph Cooper's brother were two of the people who were out searching for this fugitive. And again, his older brother's name was Dan Cooper. Well, unfortunately, there was a police officer that happened to come across the father and brother, and somehow there was something that took place, and the police officer ended up shooting both the father and the brother. Now, the father survived, ended up in the hospital, recovered, everything else. The brother, however, did not survive. He was killed by the police officer. And again, the brother's name was Dan Cooper. This took place in 1960 right there. And it was well publicized in the media at that time. Now, the family sued for wrongful death, and they sued actually for $200,000 for the death of the brother, and a separate $200,000 for the father getting shot and ultimately surviving. Wrongful death suit. Now, my understanding is that they were unsuccessful with the wrongful death lawsuit, but it is an interesting thing to consider that perhaps the real D.B. Cooper, working at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, again as an employee of Union Carbide at that point, was familiar with the story because, again, it was well reported at that time. And perhaps when it came time for him to pull off the caper in 1971, the name Dan Cooper kind of was just rolling around in the back of his mind or stuck in his craw or what have you. And that's where he conjured up the name Dan Cooper, again, the name of the brother who was killed in 1960 there. It is also interesting to note that D.B. Cooper requested $200,000, which coincidentally happens to be the same sum of money that the family was suing for the death of the brother. I'm not saying that there is necessarily a relationship there. Perhaps it's a coincidence, but it is also entirely possible that the real D.B. Cooper knew Ralph Cooper. They were co-workers and knew of the story, and perhaps that explains where the name Dan Cooper came from, and perhaps that also explains or helps sort of crystallize where that $200,000 figure came from as well. But that's an interesting side note. So, but those are the types of things that I'm diving into now, exploring and trying to see if there's a way to use that information to put a finger on somebody and figure out who this guy was.
Have you been in contact with that Cooper family, or have you researched into who's still alive that could give you some info?
Basically, the principals are all gone. Again, the Ralph Cooper guy, again, passed away a number of years ago. So I haven't actually reached out to the family. I do have contact information to the family, but I haven't reached out yet to see if they happen to recall a coworker of their father's from the 60s, 50 years earlier. I mean, that's probably a pretty tall ask, but nonetheless, I am digging into the names of other people, other men that worked there, and we're going to see if there's some sort of connection there. But it's tough because, again, we're dealing with a significant amount of time. We're dealing with a company in Union Carbide that no longer exists. Obviously, record keeping and so forth wasn't kind of as prolific as it is nowadays, and just the sheer amount of time, a lot of that stuff just ends up getting destroyed and lost over time. So, but nonetheless, I mean, there are tools and things that I can work with, obituaries and pictures of military records and things like that, I can use to kind of dig into and see if we come up with, somebody who sort of matches the description of D.B. Cooper, was, can explain the particles on the tie and that type of thing. But it's a laborious process. I think it's safe to say that that's where D.B. Cooper came from. And again, I also think it's safe to say that it's just a matter of time before we figure out who this guy is. My hope, given enough media attention with this newer stuff, this newer information, that perhaps somebody in and around Knoxville, or somebody who worked in that area or worked at Oak Ridge back then, that somebody comes forward and says, I knew of a person way back when, or something like that, or maybe my grandfather or great uncle worked there and maybe he was D.B. Cooper. I'm kind of hoping that type of thing actually materializes. That may well be the best chance to actually solve this case, is somebody being made aware of this who's in that area, who has some sort of familial relationship to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and makes the connection, puts two and two together and says, let's check this out, or let's have Eric check this out and see what we can find out.
Yeah, I was imagining this really romantic scenario where the actual D.B. Cooper is a friend of the Cooper family, and, he sits down with them at dinner and is like, listen, I'm going to go get that money for you. Ralph was my friend. Dan was, his son. Like, I just had this whole scenario in my head where he's like, if you don't hear from me, check out this area in the middle of blah, 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 or something, and your money will be there. That's just my, cinematic conclusion to this story.
I mean, I think there's a reasonably good chance that Ralph Cooper knew the real D.B. Cooper. I think there's a reasonably good chance. So it may have just been a colleague in passing, or maybe there was, maybe they knew, maybe they were best friends. I don't know. There would have been some sort of age difference there, but that's why it's an intriguing thing to explore. It's an intriguing thing to consider. That at a minimum, it is a remarkable coincidence given the name and given the sum of money and given the location and the timing and everything else. So, we just may find one loose thread like that, like the name, the connection, the story, and you pull that thread and all of a sudden the whole thing just unravels real quick, Now, getting to that thread, knowing which thread to pull, obviously has involved an enormous amount of work with the tie particles and thorium, uranium, and all kinds of research and all kinds of stuff, clay and salt and everything else. The heavy lifting may be over as far as that goes. We may have identified the exact location, and now we may, maybe down to the relatively easy part of just finding that thread and pulling and seeing and unraveling the whole story there. So it's exciting. I mean, the prospect that this guy could have come from Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 60s, the late 1960s, is very intriguing. And I would encourage anybody who's a listener to your podcast here who, is from the area or has some sort of connection or has some ideas with respect to maybe who the guy could have been or whatever the case may happen to be, reach out to me. Reach out to me and run it by me, and let's just see what we come up with. Let's just see what we come away with, because I'm quite confident that the guy came from there. The guy came from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He was in and around that area. And he was probably in and around that area in 1971, given that the matchbook was from the Sky Chef's restaurant, and seemed likely that it would have come from that one at the McGee-Tyson Airport there outside of Knoxville.
do you give out like your email address in case someone has some information for you?
Yeah, sure. My email address is out there publicly. So anybody who wants to email me, just send an email to Eric at ericulis.com. And let me spell it's Eric, ERIC, and at ericulis.com, which is ERICULIS.com. So if you shoot me an email there, I'll get it. I'll take a look at it and we'll see what we come up with. So I've had a number of people reach out to me over the years about different persons of interest or what have you. And invariably, to a man, no one has panned out at this point because we actually have a fair amount of information to work with. Again, D.B. Cooper was a guy who was described as, I believe, about 6'1". He was a guy that was about 50 years of age back in 1971. Appears to have been well educated, a metallurgist or a geologist or somebody of that ilk. He smoked cigarettes on the jet, so it seems that he was likely a cigarette smoker. Doesn't 100% guarantee that he wasn't faking in some way. Obviously familiar with aviation, parachuted out of the back, so maybe the guy had some sort of military experience. Maybe he had parachuted before, something of that nature. The guy was in decent shape back in 1971, so he wasn't a guy that didn't have a pot belly or anything like that. He was a fit guy. He had a non-discernible American accent, so it doesn't appear that he came from New York or New England, at least speaking with an accent, the Deep South speaking with an accent or anything of that nature. Probably not too unlike me. I assume I have a non-discernible American accent. That's kind of who we're working with there. And we don't have a photograph of the guy, but we do have a sketch. So we have a reasonable likeness that can help us as well. So again, if anybody who knows of anybody that may sort of kind of check those boxes there, and again, the critical piece being Oak Ridge National Laboratory, like I said, reach out to me and let's see what we come up with. Maybe we actually uncover the real D.B. Cooper. Maybe we finally put an end to this 53-year-old mystery and crack this case after 53 years and do the one thing that the FBI could not do.
And that one thing is find the Gardner Museum paintings.
That's a whole nother mystery there. But, it's like I said before, because I know we've talked about this. I know I've been on Empty Frames podcast with you guys a few times actually. I firmly believe that stuff's just not around anymore, that the artwork has been destroyed, has been burned. We got the two bronze pieces, the finial and the Chinese coup, which would still be around. I don't think they were destroyed. They're sitting at the bottom of a lake somewhere or buried underground somewhere, but I'm afraid the other stuff is long gone. So.
Well, we'd love to have you back on Empty Frames as well for any updates. I think some of our audience, I know, it feels like there's a cliffhanger that we haven't followed up on yet in regards to the paintings being in the fireplace. So yeah, we'd love to have you back on Empty Frames sometime soon too.
There is new information. There is new information related to that. So yeah, I would love to talk with you guys about it on Empty Frames and kind of bring everybody up to speed with what's going on with respect to that.
Yes, let's do it.